So, good afternoon, everybody who is joining us today for the webinar on the practices and the perspectives and the challenges of just transitions in Europe. This is a webinar that is part of a webinar series called Nature, Labor, and the Struggle for an Eco-Social World, which is organized by the Global Labour University, the European Trade Union Institute, this is where we are today, the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and the Center for Environmental Justice at the Colorado State University, USA. The series takes place in the context of the publication of a handbook which is called the Palgrave Handbook of Environmental Labor Studies. It has been edited by Dimitris Stivis, David Uzzell, and myself. And Dimitris Stivis, Professor of Political Science at Colorado State University, is present on the panel today. So good afternoon, Dimitris. And David Uzzell could not be with us because he needs to be on another appointment. So today, our speakers will be discussing issues of just transition for workers, especially in Europe. The following webinars will cover questions of environmental labor studies in the Americas and in other countries of the global North and South. I'll start with saying a few words about the structure of the webinar. So each of our three speakers will present central points of their research, and they have 10 minutes to do that. So I will ring a bell when the 10 minutes are finished. Then we have our discussant, Samantha Smith, the director of the Just Transition Center of the International Trade Union Confederation. She will comment on their presentations for another 10 minutes. After that, we will open the floor to the public for the questions that we hope you will then have already put into the Q&A section. Please only put questions into the Q&A section. Actually, you have to put the questions into the Q&A sections because you cannot put anything into the chat. You can read the chat though, and it's good to read it because in the chat, you will find a code that will give you the possibility to buy the handbook with a 20% reduction. So the last minutes will be reserved for wrapping up the session, and the session will end at 16:45. Before we start, I would like to remind us about the situation that we are in. First of all, the theme we're discussing today, the environmental crisis, is not one among many other important issues. But it is, as the IPCC has shown again in its latest report, the issue upon which the survival of humans and other species depends. But we need to recognize that on top of the environmental crisis, we live in a pandemic still, which is one of the results of the ecological crisis. But we are also experiencing a new war of aggression, Putin's war against Ukraine. The horrors of the wars, like those in Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Mali, to name just a few also happening right now, have been taken to Europe. For those of us living in Europe, this brings not only the suffering of humans closer to our conscience, but also the ecological effects of war. For instance, the militarization that is now happening. I don't know if you have heard, for instance, just one news item that Germany now wants to spend 100 billion euros on the military. And this doesn't only take resources away from social and environmental programs, but it also further destroys the life support systems of the earth through the increased extraction of materials, destroying the livelihoods of people, through absorbing materials, machines, land, and workers to use them for the construction of means of destruction, withdrawing them from the production of the means of life. In this context, I hope our discussions, questions, and suggestions in these webinars and today will hopefully also contribute to strengthening the arguments and the engagement for a world in which caring for life in all its forms is central and opposing all the forces of destruction is necessary. So I give the word now to Bela Galgossi, researcher at the European Trade Union Institute, who will talk about the necessity for a just transition for all, given the complex social inequalities in Europe particularly. Thank you, Bela.
Well, thank you, Nora. I'm just sharing, I'll try to share my, I think, so I think you have the PowerPoint, yeah? It is shared. Okay, that's good. I think I have 10 minutes or a little bit more. Nora, if you can just.
You have 10 minutes.
Okay, good, I try. First of all, thanks to you very much to bring this horrible war, the case of this war, also that reminds us how fragile our world is. And I don't want to spend much more time on that, but these issues are all interlinked with each other, both the origins and the consequences of this. But let's move on to our actual topic now. What I would like to do here is a little bit discussing about the concept of just transition and how we can move from a just transition for us or me to a just transition to all. It sounds a little bit, of course, a stupid question or easy, but it is much more complicated, as probably we will see. So what I will do here is to say a few words on inequalities in the context of environment, climate, and social. To have a glimpse into the multiple dimensions, how complicated this is with its scope and level and scale and depth, as Dimitris was putting it in a recent article really very well. Then the main layers that is still on employment, so employment change, and distributional effects. Distributional effects that also include accessibility and affordability of low carbon technologies. Then a little bit on sector specifics, then why it is so difficult for trade unions and how to get to a just transition to all concept and what it means for the role of the state. So first of all, this is just well, a little illustration. You don't need to look at everything, all details, it's too complicated, but the message of this is only that it is really complicated. So the dimensions on climate-related inequalities, that includes from carbon footprints, so the responsibility, to the effects of so vulnerability to climate change, to capacity of adaptation, to exposure of to environmental hazard. Then, according in another dimension, high income, low income, medium income countries, and then within country, income, age, gender, skills, migration status or race, housing situation. And there are even more than that. And all these factors are combined in individual cases. And we need to address all these inequalities and the way these inequalities interlink with each other. So it's kind of a tremendous undertaking. Just a glimpse what we talk about, carbon footprints in Europe. Yeah, so the bottom 50% has 4 tons per capita per year in terms of CO2 emissions. The top 1% has 43. So that's only within Europe, but in a global scale, we have a much bigger inequality in this. Just another one, this is illustrating vulnerabilities to extreme weather events, just within Europe, yeah? So on the one hand, we have countries where people are covered, insurance coverage for extreme weather events. In Lithuania, Romania, 1% of the population. In Luxembourg, Belgium, 60–70%. And within the countries, if you would look at in terms of income situation, you have a much more extreme distribution as well. So responsibility and vulnerability, that were the two things. Then we have, again, illustrative. Yeah, it is like how low carbon technologies have inherent inequality in the sense how they are financed. And this is, for example, on feed-in tariffs for 3 countries. No, it is Germany, but we have it for Netherlands and Belgium that is quite similar. This means that the households are paying the price of the investments needed for the ramp up of renewable energies, and the big industry is kind of subsidized. So, and then within households, of course, then you can imagine that it is more the poorer ones that are having the burden. So, and this is just another way. Then we have energy poverty. That is for Europe and for the entire population and for the bottom 60%. What we see here that in Bulgaria, for example, over 50% of the at-risk population to poverty is under energy poverty. And that was actually still before the energy price crisis that we are witnessing now. Job losses. It is just the coal sector job losses that are concentrated to actually Poland and some other countries, but kind of dramatic losses in jobs that we also have in other sectors as well. So that shows the transition, the green transition, and the unequal effects of the green transition to different groups, different regions, different workers. So the overall, so that's just an illustration how different dimensions we have. Then just burden sharing is the general concept of just transition that is, as I said before, has really different dimensions. But first of all, we have the employment transitions on the one hand and the distributional effects, and that has, of course, regional features. The one important thing is that having all these dimensions of inequality, climate and environment related, there had been very different traditions in the past, both in academic approaches and in advocacy groups like trade unions and NGOs. The approaches of, let's say, climate justice, employment justice, social justice, procedural justice, energy justice, were focusing on some particular dimensions on this inequality with all the historical traditions they had in 30, 40 years back in time.
2 more minutes, Bella.
Yes? Okay, I don't have time anymore. Sorry?
Yeah, 2 more minutes.
Okay, 2 more minutes. So this means that all these movements and schools were picking up one dimension of inequality. Let it be environmental, climate vulnerability on the one hand, and climate transition on the other hand. Two very different things. And then we have, so these were separate kind of focuses that were running parallel with each other. And they were not really paying attention to the interlinkages between these justices, so to say. This means that what we finally got is a very fragmented policy landscape of just transition. So everybody tends to have its own just transition perspective. The chemical worker, the automobile worker, the people in climate vulnerable countries, people paying the energy price, people who want to change or need to change mobility patterns, and so on. And this is a very fragmented picture. And what is missing is the comprehensive and coherent policy response. How you can deal with these multiple dimensions of inequalities in a coherent policy network or framework. This would be the just transition for all perspective.
Okay,
and this is actually really missing. So I don't have time to show why this is missing. If you look at the European policy landscape, for example, with the Just Transition Fund and the upcoming Climate Social Fund, we can only see that these are just a little small contributions to one particular aspect of the green transition. They are not covering the entirety. And in order to have this more comprehensive approach, the role of the state needs to go through a profound change. We need to have a different welfare state that is taking all the inequalities that are linked to the climate and the environment into account and integrated with social inequalities. This means, well, this would be something like an eco-social state, a state that has a different policy framework where, for example, all the labor market policies are facilitating change, which is—
Thank you, Bella.
That's okay, Bella. That's it. Okay, thanks a lot.
I'm very sorry.
Good.
It's over the time. Thank you.
Yeah, fine. That was actually the main point I wanted to make, and without all the details. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bella. So our next speaker is now Markus Vissen. He's professor of political science at the Berlin School of Economics and Law, and he will discuss the different ways in which workers in the global North and the global South are included into the capitalist mode of production. Thank you very much, Markus.
Yeah, many thanks, Nora, and all the organizers of this event. Yeah, I'm going to address some of the dilemmata the labor movement faces in time of an aggravating ecological crisis. I would like to make sense of these dilemmata from the perspective of a theory of hegemony We live in a very violent world, and hegemony is more about consensus than about violence. But nevertheless, we have to talk about hegemony in order to overcome violence, overcome the violence that we are currently observing and from which many people are suffering. So the question is, how can one make sense of the labor-environment relationship and dilemmata in this relationship from the perspective of a hegemony theory? And I will do that with a concept that Uli Brandt and myself call the Imperial mode of living. This is the basic concept from which I'm going to analyze these questions. Yeah. Our starting point is the observation that in the second half of the 20th century, many workers in the global north have experienced strong wealth increases that did not only rest on the strength of unions and on the productivity gains in the global north itself, but also on the extraction and transfer of raw materials from the global south, and the unpaid, and it also rested on the unpaid care work, mostly done by women in the households of the global north itself. Automobility would be an example here. In Fordism, as we call this period of capitalism that started after the Second World War, in Fordism, the automotive industry evolved into a key economic sector that provided many unionized jobs for male workers. Driving a car, which used to be a luxury phenomenon, became a phenomenon that also spread within the working class. Both in production and use, as we know, cars are extremely resource and emission intensive. They require metals that are extracted under socially and environmentally destructive conditions by workers in the global south. And driving cars, of course, emits a lot of fossil fuels and emits a lot of CO2 and drives climate change. Furthermore, the social generalization of car use has facilitated the emergence of suburban spatial structures with single wage earner households that rely on a patriarchal division of labor. In other words, automobility, while improving the material living conditions also of workers in the global north, produces socio-ecological costs that are displaced to others in space and time, to women doing the care work which is necessary for the reproduction of the labor force, to future generations whose living conditions are severely impacted by the climate crisis, and to workers in the global south who are exploited in extractive industries and whose livelihoods are destroyed by the environmental impacts of these industries. This is not to deny the class character of advanced capitalist societies, that is the exploitation and often hard-working conditions in industrial production in the global north itself. It is not to deny the much bigger ecological footprint of the rich than the working class. See the case of automobility. The rich possess more and bigger cars than the poor. It is also not to morally blame the northern working class. Rather, it is to understand the paradox. Workers may benefit to a certain degree from patterns of production and consumption that harm nature and others in space and time. These patterns are the result of a class struggle for social and political participation. They are part of a compromise between capital and labor that Timothy Mitchell has called carbon democracy. Once these patterns have been institutionalized and inscribed into social and physical infrastructure systems, workers can hardly evade them anymore. As subaltern members of a capitalist society, workers are rather forced into these production and consumption patterns. They are forced into them by caste-centered infrastructures, by an industrialized agricultural and food system, by electricity infrastructures that rely on fossil fuels. And underlying all this, they are forced into this production and consumption patterns that exploit others in space and time, that shift social and ecological costs to others in space and time by the very fact that they have little more to sell than their own labor power. This is what Uli Brandt and I call the imperial mode of living, production and consumption patterns that produce social ecological codes that they shift to others in space and time. And indeed, the modern working class has also benefited from it, but at the same time, it was forced into these production and consumption patterns into the imperial mode of living. So the imperial mode of living is not an individual choice, it is a social relationship. It is characteristic for advanced capitalist societies. It normalizes domination, power, and violence in neo-colonial North-South relations, in class and gender relations. It does so in countless acts of producing and consuming, acts that at the same time render the violence, the domination, the power invisible, at least there where the advantages of this mode of living concentrates. The imperial mode of living is also, and here I refer to the editors of the handbook, Nora, David, Dimitris, it is closely connected to the jobs versus environment dilemma. Capitalist industrialization has torn the relationship between labor and nature apart, with the consequence that jobs and the everyday life of many workers unwillingly depend on environmental destruction. More recently, the contradictions of the imperial mode of living have become more manifest. They are visible in rising inequalities. For example, also with regard to climate change. Bela talked about that. Rising inequalities, which make the imperial mode of living an unattainable promise for ever more people, even in the global north. They are visible in eco-imperial competition for resource and things. They are visible in imperialist wars. They are visible in the fact that the climate crisis is about to get out of control. So the capacities of going on with processing the class contradictions at the expense of nature, unpaid work, and neo-colonial dependencies seem to become exhausted. We live in a time of severe and accumulating crisis. Therefore, the question arises how the labor-nature relationship could be reconfigured and which role the labor movement could play therein. In our book chapter, we distinguish between three ideal typical approaches. First of all, a reactive approach, aiming to safeguard as much as possible of an otherwise environmentally destructive business as usual that has increasingly got under pressure. This is a strategy that we can observe, for example, in the mining sector, perhaps also partially also in the automotive industry, a rather defensive, a reactive approach with which trade unions try to save jobs and try to prevent the worst from happening. A second strategy would be a more proactive, strategic approach, where unions enter into alliances with environmental organizations in order to enhance their social power, their capacities to act, with the aim, for example, of creating green jobs and ecologically modernize the economy. And there's a third approach, an organic approach, as we have called that in our book chapter, an organic approach that aims to re-establish the constitutive relationship between labor and nature, which has been torn apart by the capitalist mode of production. We consider this latter, this organic approach, the most promising one, and at the same time, it is the most ambitious approach. There are examples for this approach, like the Million Climate Jobs campaign in South Africa, for example. The ITF also partially stands for this approach. Trade unions for energy democracy, or more recently, there was a strike in German collective bargaining that was collectively organized by Fridays for Future and the service union Verdi. These are examples for such an organic approach that links labor and environmental issues in a way that puts together this destructive relationship between labor and environment. In capitalism, it does so via looking beyond capitalism. So this organic approach is about combining the creation of decent work with the protection of the environment and with the provision of communities with essential infrastructures.
One more minute.
Okay. More generally, it is about rethinking labor and the whole economy from the point of view of social reproduction. That is, from the point of view of the reproductive necessities of human bodies and of nature. This is indeed very ambitious. It requires the productive handling of a lot of ambivalences and dilemmata. Furthermore, public ownership and democratic control of the means of production and subsistence are important preconditions of such a strategy, or implications of such a strategy. Reclaiming them and searching for the respective social and international alliances, nevertheless, will be crucial for overcoming the imperial mode of living, for overcoming a lot of crisis phenomena with which we are confronted at the moment, for overcoming them in favor of a good life for all. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marcus. You can all develop your points later in the discussion session when you're answering questions. So the next speaker will be Adrien Thomas and Valerie Pulignano, and they are from the Luxembourg Institute of Economic Research, and they will highlight the complexity of environmental labor policies, given that they act on different levels, the national, international level, national level, the sector level, and the company level. Okay, thank you very much, Adrien Thomas.
Yes, thank you, Nora, for your words of introduction. Just a slight correction. I myself am working at the Luxembourg Institute of Socioeconomic Research, but my co-author, Valeria Pulignano, is working at KU Leuven, at University of Leuven. And I'm going to present it's no problem. I'm going to present the chapter that Valeria and myself co-authored in the handbook of environmental labor studies. And I'm going to do the presentation, and Valeria then is going to intervene more during the discussion. So we are going to talk about the multi-level engagement of trade unions with climate change mitigation, focusing in particular on the debates in the European Union. Okay, no, that's sorry about okay, that's all right. The aim of this research is to generate a better understanding of trade unions' climate change strategies. So two questions are at the center of this presentation. How are trade unions dealing with climate change at the different levels of trade union action? And a second question, how are they articulating members' interests and broader societal concerns over climate change? The presentation relies on documentary analysis and on interviews which were conducted with trade union representatives, with employer representatives, and a small number of policymakers at different levels. If one talks about different levels of trade union action, just to be very clear about this, here's a small diagram. There's the international level of union action. This is a level where generally broad principles are discussed. For instance, the conventions by the International Labour Organization. At the European level, things are maybe a bit more hands-on, as the European Trade Union Confederation has indeed interlocutors with the European institutions. So there's somebody to speak to directly, be it the European Council, be it the European Commission, or the European Parliament. Then you have the national level, where social dialogue may be going on labor legislation, on social policies, where trade unions discuss with national governments. Then you have the sector and company level. For the purpose of this presentation, we are going to consider the sector and the company level together. This is the level where trade unions normally engage with employers' organizations or with individual companies over collective bargaining, where they bargain over wages and working conditions at the sector and company level. So what are the union attitudes towards decarbonization at these different levels? And in how far is there policy coherence between these different levels of union action when it comes to climate change mitigation policies? At the international level, I think it is fair to say that there's a general support among international trade unions for ambitious climate action. If one looks at the policy positions of the International Trade Union Confederation, of the European Trade Union Confederation. Here, the just transition narrative is playing a crucial part. The international trade union movement, be it the International Trade Union Confederation or the European Confederation, have used the just transition as a sort of master narrative to push a number of union priorities in the field of climate policies. And these priorities are focused around issues such as decent jobs, social protection, training opportunities, retraining opportunities, and job security. And this has, in the European Union, already led to tangible policies, public policies, with the EU Just Transition Fund for regions dependent on fossil fuels and on high emissions industries. The Just Transition Fund is a program funded by the European Commission to support carbon and coal-intensive regions, which can be expected to be strongly impacted by decarbonization. And to receive support from this fund, member states are supposed to submit territorial just transition plans that should, in principle, be developed together with social partners. So this leaves, at least in theory, a role for trade unions. At the national level, there's a wider variety of union positions regarding decarbonization. These positions often oscillate between proactive and reactive approaches, as Markus has already been lining out in his contribution. Here, a lot depends on the configuration of national political economies. Geopolitical interests also play an important role, and the current war in Ukraine is a powerful reminder of the relevance of such geopolitical interests. There is also, of course, the sectoral distribution of the union membership. In what sectors are union members mostly active? And there's also the relevance of the ideological orientations of trade unions. There are some unions in Europe who are more strictly focused on the wages and working conditions of their members, whereas other unions have a tradition of broader societal commitment and of a broader approach. Finally, there's the sector company level. Here, mostly the impression that one gets from the literature is that there's a prevalence of economic and employment concerns. And there's, of course, also a degree of heterogeneity that is related to the fact that a number of economic sectors can be expected to gain from the decarbonization of the economy if one thinks, for example, about carbon renewable energies, about ecological construction, and then there are a number of sectors that can be expected to lose out. Of course, everything related to carbon intensive industries and fossil fuel extraction and processing. And one of the difficulties is that many unions are mostly established in carbon intensive industries, because these industries often are older, and the older a company is, the more likely a union presence is in that company. And these are also also often companies or industries where there's a huge concentration of workers, which also increases the likelihood of a trade union being present. Now we are going to look at the factors that can facilitate or impede coordination and articulation across levels of union action. So in how far is it possible to move towards stronger coordination of union positions across these different levels? Because on the one hand, the multi-level structure of trade unionism is of course an asset, because it enables interactions with policymakers, with employer organizations, and with companies at different levels. And in this way, trade unions can make their voice heard at different levels where decisions are taken, and they have, of course, a bigger chance of influencing policymaking. But on the other hand, multi-level policymaking also raises the risk of policy inconsistencies across the different levels of union action. And this tends to happen if every level of union action tends to pursue its own priorities without necessarily taking into account the broader picture.
1 more minute.
Okay, especially at sector and company level, unions may engage in alliances with employers, and this may lead them then to take over the employers, the companies' position regarding climate policies. And this is, of course, a tendency which is reinforced by the current support in many countries for decentralization of collective bargaining, whereby micro-corporatist arrangements at the company level are encouraged, and where union representatives at the company level may pursue policy priorities that are not necessarily coordinated with national or sectoral priorities. Climate change, of course, also presents a specific challenge, as it does not only concern as it does not only have an impact on workers and companies, but as it also impacts the whole of society and has far-reaching implications. And this touches upon the issue of the conceptions of union democracy. Do unions see their role as a simple reflection of their current members' interests, or do they see themselves as having a broader, maybe broader political, socio-political mandate, also taking into account the interests of non-unionized workers and of society as a whole? To sum things up, on climate change policies, trade unions face the challenge of combining centralized decision-making, the need for analytic resources, and shop floor involvement. Centralized decision-making is important as it is necessary for unions to coordinate the points of view of their different member groups over decarbonization policies. In order to achieve this coordination, political leadership is necessary to establish a synthesis out of the various points of view that are present within unions. Analytical resources are also necessary because climate change is a new topic for unions, and decarbonization raises many questions in the field of industrial policies or in the field of international trade policies, where unions need to have a degree of technical expertise. Finally, shop floor involvement of the rank and file union members is crucial, because this involvement at shop floor level gives unions a flexibility and an ability to respond to company-specific issues or to sector-specific issues. And I thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Adrien, and thank you very much for all of you keeping in time. So now we can listen to Samantha Smith, the director of the Just Transition Center of the International Trade Union Confederation. Samantha, what are your comments regarding to the speeches that you have just listened to?
Yes. Well, so first of all, thank you very much for the chance to participate in and to comment in today's webinar. I'll just have a few comments. I feel like this is kind of a continuing conversation that Bella and I and many others have had over the last few years. But maybe I'll just situate myself a little bit and then give some responses from that perspective. So what we do at the Just Transition Center is we help unions get good plans for just transition. And that is unions not only in Europe, but all over the world. So pretty much equally split between global North and global South. And we work pretty much only with unions in high emitting countries and high emitting sectors, because this is where you have the greatest impacts on jobs right now. So this is actually with a climate emissions driven approach, but also an approach that is driven by what our members and their elected leaders want. And where they want just transition most is where the most jobs seem to be at risk for the moment. And that means also the energy sector. So power, mining, also renewables, oil and gas, steel, auto, other forms of heavy manufacturing, construction, transport, and a little bit of agriculture now. Now you might take from this that our job is really just about making sure that those who work in these sectors right now, and these sectors because most of them are critical to the functioning of the state or of economies, most of these sectors like energy are pretty well organized. We have higher union density than in other parts of the economy. It's the commanding heights of the economy, if you will, that our job is really just about making sure that that there are new jobs for the people who work in these sectors today. And if there aren't going to be new jobs for everybody, that people have a bridge to pension or to some other kind of social protection. But that's actually not correct. Because when you're talking about just transition, it's not really using the process that has been negotiated in the United Nations, which is what we use, right? So the International Labor Organization's guidelines on just transition are the basis for our work, and also for what trade unions are doing on just transition across our movement, with it looking a bit different in different countries. But really, a just transition is, it's got a community aspect. So for example, social protection in the context of just transition is for everyone, not just for the people whose jobs are at risk. In a process of just transition, you would also look at how, as trade unionists, we would look at how can we make every job good in the region, including jobs that are typically held by women, let's say. I mean, some of these energy communities have pretty patriarchal structures. So we would also be looking at what are the jobs that women hold, formal or informal. How can we make those jobs good? And then last but not least, I mean, we're kind of missing the perspective that just transition is based on human rights, right? It's explicit in the UN architecture on just transition. It's based on human rights. The ILO highlights especially not only labor rights, but gender rights, but also just, remind everyone that the ILO is also the home of the UN Convention on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there is also a UN Declaration on Race and Racism. So when we're talking about just transition, we're like, oh, it doesn't have these important aspects of the rights of Indigenous people or race and racial issues or white supremacy. It is nestled within this UN framework of different aspects of human rights that, at least when we're trying to apply it on the ground, all come into play. So just to go specifically to some of the questions that are coming up here, you might have gathered from what I said that what we do is actually, I'm not a researcher. I am an activist and maybe a kind of grouse tops organizer. And so, so my answers will be based on that. I mean, we're in a situation right now here in Europe where there is a massive war with violations of human rights, you know, right at the edge of Europe, right? And the responses to it, as we heard at the start of this meeting, include remilitarization of almost every European country, including the country where I live, Norway, but also a sudden huge push to try to complete an energy transition in a very short period of time. So, and at the same time, the price of energy, as well as the price of, you know, basic foodstuffs, just gone through the roof, right? So if we take our roots in our movement, which are to work to improve the material conditions of the working class, what are the conclusions that we draw from this unjust transition? Well, the first one has to be that poor and working class households should not be bearing the burden of extremely high energy and food prices. So this goes a little bit to Bella's point about what is the role of the state in just transition. In this particular moment, the role of the state is to make sure that people can keep their houses warm and feed their families, right? Like if you can't afford to do that, then the state has lost the plot. The second role is to make sure, I mean, if EU member states are not up for system change, nonetheless, they can take some steps to take some of the windfall profits that we see right now, and not just to sort of shovel subsidies towards citizens while leaving the profits that energy companies have alone, right? That can't be right. So there needs to be much stronger action from the member states and from the EU on ensuring that that companies and their owners are not taking these windfall profits that should actually be going back to people who are paying for energy, which is a public good. The third thing is that it's pretty clear that if in fact you're going to have two big industrial things happening at the same time. So one is remilitarization. So that's manufacturing of armaments, just to say it, call it what it is. And the other is a very fast-paced energy transition. You're going to have a huge amount of emissions associated with both of those things. Why? Because it requires steel to make wind turbines as well as to make munitions. So we urgently need industrial planning and industrial strategy that is going to keep emissions down, that is going to make sure that poor and working class people are not paying for the energy use that we're going to see with both of these things. And I'm not contesting remilitarization because that horse is out the barn door now, like that is happening. We can protest it, we can push back against our governments, but that is also where we are. And we need to be sure that the state invests in the kinds of low emissions processes and technologies and sites that we need in order to secure the energy transition. And last but not least, just a really simple to-do list for everyone who is an activist and who is interested in how this transition plays out for people. I mean, one is no windfall profits. Two is make sure that all of these vast expenditures of money that we're going to see now for the energy transition, that these are attached to good jobs. Because the last thing I'll say about union democracy and our strategies is we take our members as they are, our members and people who should be our members. Not all of our members care about socialism, but all of them care about jobs and conditions. And if you think that the sort of fundamental political struggle that drives all other struggles is a struggle between labor and capital, then this struggle about wages and conditions and discrimination in hiring and safety at work, that is actually still a fundamental or the fundamental struggle, which unions are carrying out every day when they are trying to negotiate, to claw back some of the surplus value of their labor and some control of the means of production. So I'll just stop there. I'm happy to take some questions though, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Samantha. That was very insightful. We're now in the session where we can take questions, and we cannot answer all the questions. There are lots of questions, 16, as you may see in the question and answer section. So there are many questions to Bela to describe more in detail how he defines the eco-social state and how we get there. So maybe, Bela, you can use 3 minutes to discuss that a bit further.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much for the many questions. It's an easy to put question, but hard to answer, and I'm afraid there are still no answers, at least not answers that are going into policy detail. So the idea first is that the state itself has a profound responsibility in, first of all, addressing the challenges that are linked to the climate and environmental crisis, to cover the risks that are attached to these challenges. So this would mean an extension of the traditional welfare state that was originally sought to cover social and employment risks from the individual, that would suppose to extend this to environmental and climate related risks and all the interlinkages that these have with the social and the employment. So there is not a very long, but quite a long history in the academic literature about concepts. Again, I don't want to mention Fritz and Koch and Jacobson and Yango, Eloi Laurent recently also taking up the issue of the health system. So there are initiatives and ideas, but there is no policy, concrete policy concept. What I would first emphasize that there is, again, the labor market and the distributional aspect. For the labor markets, we need to have a labor market policy framework that is not penalizing change, because what we have now in this current segmented, precarious labor market situation is that people are only feeling safe to stick to their current jobs. And any change is an incredible risk to take. And this is what we simply cannot afford, because to have this transition ahead of, we need profound change, tens of millions of jobs to change. So this means a different labor market policy framework. One hint that for the European context, this is a rather big challenge, because the EU as a whole doesn't have competencies on labor market and social policies. It is mostly the member states. And then we end up in a huge fragmentation, and that adds to the challenge. For the social aspect, I have to say that we have some fragmented policies. Fragmented policies like the Just Transition Fund and the upcoming Climate Social Fund. These are very, very small and dealing with one little problem, but not the entirety. Yeah, that needs to be much more comprehensive and much more extended. For example, for the distribution issues. Now we are facing the energy crisis, and to some extent also transport crisis. Energy poverty and transport poverty, these are coming up on the agenda, and they definitely need meaningful responses by the state itself. But it is not enough, because we have affordability and accessibility issues. The real problem is that mostly low-income people are locked into fossil energy traps and situations. And as long as they are there, for example, having the diesel cars and having oil or gas heating, and bad insulation and housing quality, to move out, and then in this situation you get the prices high, then you are penalizing those people who are trapped in these positions. So we need to move ahead with investments, with programs, with a really kind of complex policy framework. So it is. Okay, sorry, it is just too complicated.
No, thank you very much, Bella. Yeah, it is a very complex issue, but we've got a glimpse of it, of the direction, and it's very important what you said, that policies are so fragmented, and we really need to get beyond these fragmentations. Valeria, no, Marcus, I take you in the same order than you spoke. Marcus, there were also a number of questions for you, and I would just like to ask you to discuss two of them. For instance, how can you expect workers in the global north to go beyond the imperial mode of living if that means that their children will have not the same standard of living than they have? And the other question is whether there is a socialist network in Europe that cooperates and controls policies together with and in the interest of poorer European countries and countries of the global south. So first, how to convince people to go beyond the imperial mode of living?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. Thanks for the two questions. I don't think that going beyond the imperial mode of living necessarily means to have a lower standard of living than the current generation. I think it could also be a different standard of living. Going beyond the imperial mode of living would mean to redefine our welfare model, to define welfare in completely different terms. Of course, we need a certain material basis, but we also need free time. Going beyond the imperial mode of living can also mean having more free time available for work that is not considered work at the moment because it is not wage labor. Work that consists of engagement in communities, political engagement, personal education, and so on. For this, one would have more time, and this does not necessarily mean a lower standard of living. I think that we need to go beyond the imperial mode of living in order to keep and to transform the current standard of living. I would like to remind to quote Mike Davis, who once said that what makes societies socially just also makes them environmentally sustainable. I think this is very true. Look at our cities. If we make them more environmentally sustainable by going beyond the imperial mode of living, that is enhancing public transport, creating green spaces, pushing back the influence of cars and the density of cars, makes cities more livable, makes them more socially just, because poorer people may have better access to public infrastructures and so on. So I would deny that going beyond the imperial mode of living means to really have a lower living standard. I think it can even improve the living standard. It can even create new jobs. In Germany, we discuss about the possibilities of a conversion of the automotive sector into a mobility sector. There are studies that show that very strong transformation of the mobility sector with an enhancement of the of public transport, with an enhancement of the possibilities to walk around, to go by bike, and so on. The bike infrastructures creates more jobs than are lost in the automotive sector, which indeed has to shrink in order to cope with the environmental problems. So I would say there are a lot of possibilities to combine a high certain model of wealth that is generalizable, that can be lived by everybody, with an environmentally sustainable society. This would be my answer to the first question. The second question is also quite difficult, because I think there is not such a socialist network. At least I'm not aware of that. Yeah. So here I think, yeah, we see the fact that the capitalist societies or that capitalism is divided into different nation states. Yeah. And that within these nation states, compromises are organized, but beyond the nation states, it's much more difficult to organize compromises. It is not by accident that there is no a kind of European transfer mechanism that helps to transfer wealth from the richer European member states to the poorer ones. Yeah. It is not by accident. This has to do with national competitiveness. It has to do with the national competition, the competition among the member states, even in the European Union. And if we look beyond the European Union towards the global south, it's even more difficult. Yeah. Of course, we have development aid. Yes, there is, yeah, but this is not enough. Yeah. And of course, we know that this development aid often is a support, a subsidy for the own domestic industry, for the own export industry. So we have to create such networks, such socialist networks that are able to push for a redistribution of wealth, or that are able to push, first of all, for production and consumption patterns that do not go on with shifting social ecological hosts to others in space and time. This would be a predominant task and predominant challenge of progressive forces in Europe and all over the world. You're still muted?
Yes, I saw that, and there was a big sign also on my computer saying you're muted. So the next questions are for Valeria and Adrien. And there are also a number of questions, but there's also one about the question where unions in your expertise are more influential, on which level are they more influential? And another question also again about the inequalities. Are there any movements in trade unions of the global north in order to assist unions in the global south and in poorer countries with resources, with technical advice, and with education? Can you say something about those questions? Thank you.
Shall I go? And yeah, okay. And then I give also, of course, the floor to Adrien. Thank you very much. And yeah, very interesting discussion. Well, I first, yeah, will try to give an answer and then pass it to Adrien for filling it more. So where is most well, rather than expertise, perhaps is where the power of the unions is more, you know, kind of having grip on. But I would say that certainly is more into, you know, when you go more at the local level and the national level, simply because of history of traditions of the trade unions movement. I mean, trade unions are in fact eradicated in their own kind of constituencies. Of course, at the European level and also international level, there is a lot of capacity, but the capacity there is just of support and coordination. If things don't function on the national level and in companies where then depending on the different system in different European settings, because we have to say also that, but there is very difficult, you know, also at the European international level to kind of coordinate and find ways to make things working. And perhaps it's also there that inequalities are more subject to increase. I mean, we see that in fact, when there are imbalances of powers created by the different kind of existing within the industrial ecosystem in different countries, we see that these inequalities are much more prevalent, and growing from the bottom up. I think that perhaps in terms of assistance then gets into the same question. I mean, certainly at the European international level, there is a lot of support and a lot of capacity which can be delivered to support national and sectoral and local unions. But again, the power, exists much more in this kind of context, and is there that also I would say possibilities for kind of recalibrating should exist. And there I would like to just, and then I give to Adrian, just to link into the interesting discussion, which was also a learning point for me about, if we are able really to succeed in terms of these transitions, we need to be able to succeed, first of all, socially speaking. I think what has been raised by Bella and also Samantha before is very important and interesting. I mean, we have a kind of subject in front of us, which is ill, which is our society. If we don't treat the society first, we cannot treat the issue of and the effects of the climate change will generate. If we don't do that, policy speaking as well, but also in a much more broader way, we will perhaps risk to increase inequalities more and more, rather than kind of fixing really and saving the kind of situation in Europe. And I just pass it over to Adrian. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria. I of course completely agree what Valeria has been saying. I think just what is interesting to note is that international trade unions have managed to push this notion of just transition, to have it mentioned at least in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, and that this is of course a resource for trade unions all over the world to engage with governments. However, if one looks at because there's the question of the relationship between trade unions in the global north and in the global south, and first of all, one has to say that there's maybe not enough, there's not that much research which is being done on trade unions in the global south. So we are also maybe lacking information on the development and on the state of trade unions in the different parts of the world. But one thing that has been shown by studies of international trade union organizations is that these organizations generally are heavily dominated by the northern trade unions, who have more resources to commit, who have more abilities to travel.
You have frozen? Have you frozen only for me or also for others?
For me too.
Yeah,
Okay.
for me too, yeah.
Okay, then I would give the word then to Dimitris, because anyway, we are 1 minute beyond time. Samantha has also mentioned in the chat, and I will give this information further to our listeners, that there is cooperation between trade unions of the global north and the global south, and also help from the global north unions to the global south. Actually, we did a lot of research about trade unions in the global south, and we have also analyzed the power relations of which Adrian was speaking between the trade unions of the global north and the global south. So it's not all cooperation and love between them. But Dimitris, I want to give it over to you and ask you to wrap up our interesting session. What did you take as the main points and the relationships between what people were saying?
A very interesting session. In fact, thank you very much, Nora, and everybody else. One of the things that became apparent from the presentations and the discussion is how broad environmental labor studies is. We can discuss the eco-social society and state, which is of importance not only to labor environmentalists, but also to people who study environmental politics in general. A multi-level analysis of unions and just transitions, global north and global south within Europe, the global divisions of labor that Marcus discussed and the implications of that for understanding work, production and consumption, and the need to be both inclusive and responsive, as Samantha mentioned, and how we reconcile that. One of the things that has taken place since we edited this volume and during the process of editing this volume, to me, was how environmental labor studies is expanding, at least in my mind, and how centered it is and should be around work and nature that a number of you mentioned. Do we work? It's a very, very important question. Do we have a decent job? What are the conditions of work? What are the social divisions of labor within and across countries? I think it's a very important area. How we work, what are the technical divisions of labor? Are they environmentally sound? Are they socially sound? Are the production processes appropriate? And finally, what do we produce and why? And I think that's a very important and timely question. We need to ask, what do we produce? What are its implications environmentally? I showed something that Bella put up that's very relevant. And why? And as was mentioned, we definitely produce things to reproduce ourselves, to exist. But unfortunately, as current events show and the human history shows, we also produce things to destroy. So when we think about work and nature, it is very important for us to also interrogate why it is and how it is that our political economies are tailored not only about certain kinds of reproduction, but unfortunately also certain kinds of destruction, whether that's preparation for it or actual happening. But I really appreciate the breadth of your presentations, and I've learned a great deal, and I appreciate working with all of you. Thank you very much, Nora, and everybody.
Thank you very much, everybody, for your presentations. And I'm sorry we had such a short time for discussions, but thank you also very much to all the participants. We had 200 in between. Now we have still 147. So thank you for staying there. And of course, the discussion goes on. And the next webinars will actually be about workers and trade unions in the global south. So if you're interested in that part, the next two webinars will especially concentrate on those. You can see in the chat the link to the other webinars and also the link to the possibility to buy the book, which is unfortunately very expensive with a 20% discount. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much to the ETUI for hosting this webinar. Goodbye to everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.